hands down, one of the top three questions that single women are often asked is what happens if you get older, you didn't have children, you're not in a relationship, and you feel lonely? What happens then? And if you have been paying attention to anything that's been happening in the media, you know that they speak of a male loneliness epidemic. And I'm seeing more and more writers, social media commentators saying that there is a female loneliness epidemic on its way, and that in the next few decades, because of the choices that women are making to remain single, they are going to rue the day, as it were, because at some point they will be lonely and they'll only have themselves to blame, because this will be a self-inflicted state of being. And so what we're going to talk about today is loneliness, and single women in particular. We received a brilliant question about this from a young woman a couple of videos ago, and I couldn't find her comment again after it came up. So I wrote about loneliness and single women on Substack. The link to that article will be in the comments and or in the description box if you prefer to read. But here is the thing. We often talk about loneliness, I feel, in a very dishonest and one-dimensional way, because culturally, fear-mongering women with this threat, okay, of being lonely is usually done in a way so as to warn women. Okay, there's a lot of stigma around being a single woman and feeling lonely. I see people come up on my feed, certainly more so on TikTok, with women who will talk about how lonely they feel as a single woman and the fact that they may not be happy. So whereas there's lots of women who are single by choice and who say that they're enjoying freedom and enjoying their life, they're not one of those women. And one of the things that they point to quite often is this feeling of loneliness. You know, there's been the old trope so that you'll be a cat lady, you'll be a spinster, nobody wants you, you'll die alone, you'll regret being single. And I think what we need to do is have more honest conversations about what loneliness is, the different types of loneliness, and the fact that it is not unique to single women, and that loneliness is not necessarily a byproduct or as a result of being single. Okay. So let's get stuck in, because there are different types of loneliness. And I wrote about this on the Substack because I think it's important for us to realize that you can be alone, but not lonely, first of all. Also, there's emotional loneliness. Lots of people feel like nobody truly understands them. You could be in a room full of people. You can be in a family setting. You can be in a marriage. You can be a parent. You can have friends and still feel lonely. So emotional loneliness is a type of loneliness. Intellectual loneliness, I have talked about this before, in that, you know, you might not have people that you can intellectually spar with, that can meet you intellectually. And when I talk about intellect, I'm not talking only about academic attainment, because a lot of the time when I talk about intelligence and intellect, people assume I'm talking about academia, and in fact I'm actually not. Yes, traditional academic education is an element, or can contribute to a type of intelligence, because again, there are different types of intelligence. But I'm talking about intellectual loneliness can be around, you know, learning, your curiosity for life. Maybe you are somebody who enjoys, you know, philosophy, whatever it might actually be. Okay, you could feel very intellectually lonely. There's also existential loneliness, grief, loss, trauma, the loneliness of carrying experiences that you might feel that other people in your proximity, in the vicinity, do not understand. Okay. And although I did say that even though you might be physically alone, you might not be lonely, for some people, okay, living alone, sleeping alone, going home to an empty home or an apartment is lonely for them. So this is the first thing I think we need to be really clear on, is that there are different types of loneliness, and you can experience one or more of them at any given time. But again, not all of them are necessarily caused by singleness. Okay, this is really, really important. And then the last thing I did want to mention, which I talked about actually on the Substack, was touch deprivation. I think that a lot of the time, when we're having these conversations about being single, particularly as you age, you know, People are touch deprived. And I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about hugs, presence, human contact, warmth, comfort. Okay. And so this touch deprivation is real. Okay. And when you think about human development and survival, that's one of the reasons why skin to skin contact is encouraged immediately when a baby is born. Often, when babies are surrendered and they're taken to a hospital or a care facility, they work on touch because of how important touch is for the feeling of safety, for survival, and for that baby's system, nervous system, the immune system to do what it's meant to do when they are at their most vulnerable. That doesn't really change because we become adults. It's just that because of culture, our relationship quite often with physical touch, as in human touch, can change because of all sorts of cultural norms, okay, and ways of living. That's why we see there's a whole profession which is professional huggers. These are individuals who get paid to hug people, but it's really that same kind of feel around the nervous system, your immune system, and it's a human need. And so, physical presence is incredibly important for human beings in general. And so when I talk about touch deprivation, often people reduce it solely down to sexual contact, but in actual fact, that has nothing necessarily to do with it. And so there are different types of loneliness. And I think that we need to acknowledge that first. And just to give you a bit of an example here, in the religion that I grew up in, there were very strict rules around contact and association between opposite members of the opposite sex, right? So, as a woman and man that are single and unmarried, and actually, even if you're married, but you should not be spending time. The rules are you do not spend any time, now, alone time or even prolonged periods of time with a member of the opposite sex. And so something as simple as sitting in the car together. Maybe you've gone out on a worship activity and you sit in the car with a member of the opposite sex. That is not allowed. That is not advisable. And actually, should somebody see you in the congregation or an elder, you will be picked up on that. Okay, so you're not meant to be alone in any kind of space. I mean, even, sometimes if you're out on the ministry, which is the preaching work, if you're working together on the ministry in a pair, if you've got to go from one area to the next, again, the rules are that you wouldn't travel in the car together at all. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because in that environment, there is a lot of loneliness. And a lot of the time, it is attributed to singleness. Okay. However, looking back, if I'm very honest, I think because of how heavily even platonic interactions are monitored and surveilled, because that's essentially what happens. Um, of course, if you happen to be single, you're not also experiencing the presence of other people, and specifically, yes, male and female dynamic, okay? Because obviously there is the belief that that leads to temptation. And so by not spending any alone time whatsoever, even in mundane ways, and like I say, that it's not just the alone time, it's also, let's say, I don't know, you've gone out on the ministry together 10, 12 times. Sometimes that may attract suspicion about why you're spending time together if you are not courting and you're not married. And when I look back on that, I realize that I think a lot of people who are single in these types of environments, the loneliness feels more existential because they don't necessarily have healthy variety of warmth and presence and human contact. I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about human contact. And because that is discouraged, okay, there's only so much time sometimes as a single woman you can spend. If your friends are married, they're with their husbands. If you don't have a lot of single friends at that period of time, because obviously sometimes when you're single in these environments for a while, it's almost like a revolving door where your friends will get married and you have to reorientate yourself in terms of friendships. You could go periods of time outside of worship, group worship activities, where you're not having much contact with other people. And of course, that gets more intense as you age, okay? Just because of the nature of life and the way we change in terms of how we associate with other people as we age. We might be less social, etc. And when I was writing the Substack article, it reminded me of that a lot of the time we attribute singleness and we attribute loneliness to singleness, when in actual fact sometimes it's the environment that we're in. And it's more of a case of, do we have healthy relationships with other people and a variety of people? Because I think one of the things that we do underestimate, I think, in these broader conversations that constantly are labeled as gender wars, is that of course the male female dynamic is incredibly, it can be incredibly healthy and healthful. All right, it's fulfilling, it's enriching to have a variety of people that you have as friends, that you are associating with, that are also other genders. Okay, and so in a religious environment like that, that is heavily monitored and heavily surveilled, to the point where sometimes it doesn't happen at all. And I know this from experience. I listen to many of my female friends and peers talk about the fact that they actually could go years without having any real contact with men outside of the group worship. Okay, and they would talk about the impact that had had on their development, and it intensifies, of course, whatever feelings they might have about being single and the reasons why they are single. And I do find it interesting, for me being on the outside of the religion now, because when I was inside the religion, of course, the singleness was often compounded by the fact that in that religion you can only court and marry individuals who are baptized, okay, in that religion. And so the pool is a lot smaller for the women, because there are more women than men also. But what's interesting for me, having been outside of that religion now for 5 odd years, 5 6 years, is that obviously the broader conversations happening online and offline is about singleness, gender wars, and the decline in marriage, which is quite interesting, because when you're in that religion you think it's quite unique because of the dynamics at play in that religion. And in actual fact, it seems like this is an epidemic all over the world, regardless of race, you know, geographics, whatever it might be. And I remember the very first time when I, made friends outside of the religion, some of whom are male. And I remember the first time on the way home from an event, for example, I got a lift home. That meant I was sitting in a car alone with a man. And I distinctly remember this feeling of self awareness. I was very aware that if I was in the religion that I grew up in, this would not be allowed and I would not be doing that. It was just one of those weird moments, because actually there was nothing untoward, inappropriate whatsoever about the interaction between myself and my male friend. But actually, having male friends really did enrich my life. The way I saw certain things, it is, when you can have healthy relationships with people of all genders, it does make a difference to you as a person. So, ultimately, there are different forms of intimacy outside of romantic relationships that have nothing to do with sex and nothing to do with romance. But it is important to acknowledge that connection, companionship in whatever form that looks like for you, presence, warmth. Sometimes people just want to go to a movie with someone, or they want to go out to eat with somebody, or, they want to read a book in the presence of somebody else. Sometimes it is really the physical presence that people are looking for. Now, at this point, I think it is important to state the obvious, because marriage and or parenthood does not eliminate loneliness at all. This is why we see so much content and conversation around marriages and keeping them together, and people outgrowing each other, and people advising you to marry your best friend. That whole thing is about the value of what? Friendship as a foundational pillar of intimacy. So if it was that easy and simple and guaranteed that you would never experience loneliness in a marriage, then that wouldn't be such a prevalent conversation. Okay, married people still describe feeling lonely. Okay, they still describe emotional disconnection, dead bedrooms, a lack of intimacy, a lack of friendship in the marriage. Okay, and so you would be unwise to believe that marriage or a relationship is going to automatically solve a current loneliness episode or season that you're in. And the same goes when it comes to having children. Again, Do we not see so many conversations around parents who are no contact, children who are no contact, elderly people in homes who have children, but none of those children come to visit them? Okay, parenthood itself is not a guarantee that you will always have familial, meaningful, sincere love, companionship, company, presence from other people. So having children is not an insurance policy against the experience, what is a human experience of loneliness. Okay, I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm not attacking marriage or parenthood. What I am simply naming is the reality. Okay, people experience loneliness because we're humans, because that's the world that we live in at times. Okay, it is not ultimately about your marital status. Now, here's another truth that I think that most of us have to live with, and I think the younger you are, the more important this becomes. We can't predict the future. Okay, it's none of us really know what the future is going to hold and how exactly we're going to feel in the future, how with hindsight we are going to think about decisions that we made in the past. Nobody knows, and therefore the future is uncertain for all, and that includes married women. If you talk to married women, the life that they're living now, 10, 20 years down the line, is not necessarily what they predicted or anticipated before. When you talk to divorced women, separated women, did they predict that? Who knows, right? And so the future is not certain for anyone, regardless of their marital status, quite frankly. And if you are looking for a relationship to kind of heal or fill a gap in a very core, internal space that you have that needs to be filled, that also could be very problematic, because you don't know whether the partner that you choose has the capacity, the bandwidth, and the willingness to help you fill this internal space, this internal need that you might have, like I said, that may have nothing to do with your marital status. All right. And often that can be a very unfair expectation to have of somebody else. So the real work of adult life, quite frankly, is to build, contribute, and participate in community, is to, again, nurture and maintain meaningful friendships, like participate in life, contribute, connect with people, right? And it is true that when you're a single adult, you have to make more of an effort to do that. And I'm telling you, as somebody who is an introvert, I enjoy spending time by myself. I can go days without leaving my apartment quite happily. I'm not somebody whose energy comes from the external. I don't need to be in big social spaces and environments to be stimulated and to be energized. I'm somebody who is more internally energized and stimulated. I'm very self-driven. However, that means that as an adult, that I have to think, right, okay, how am I socializing this month, this quarter? How am I going to do that? And that requires effort, because sometimes I can't be asked to put a bra on. I just can't, right? And I'm quite happy in my home. I'm not dissatisfied with my own company. I quite like my own company. But the point is that as an adult, when it comes to community and friendships and connections, you have to be proactive, and it does require effort. Now, at this point, I do want to touch back on something I mentioned earlier, because there is a narrative that I believe is a deliberate narrative, and it's being used to fear among women in particular. And it's being used in connection with the fact that, yes, women have more agency, more independence, they can be self-sufficient financially. And quite frankly, finances aside, women are paying more attention to their well-being, to their nervous system regulation, and their peace. And that is something that I see often being mocked online, in particular by misogynistic men, because what they need you to believe is that you will end up lonely because you did not settle, okay, for something you did not want. You did not settle for a relationship that does not fulfill those particular healthy needs, right? That is not fulfilling, is not mutually fulfilling. mutually enriching, mutually upbuilding. Now, look, some people are going to marry and be in relationships for survival. That's just a fact of the matter. And so they're not thinking too deeply necessarily about, their partner's emotional makeup, emotional maturity, emotional intelligence. Let's just be very real. That isn't high on everybody's list of requirements when they go into a relationship. Things like kindness, these intelligence, like these are kind of preferences that a lot of people, evidently, when you look at the state of their relationships and the general satisfaction of their life, those weren't priorities when they selected their partner. However, there are some women who are looking for more than just necessarily finances in a partner. They may have preferences that are really about that person's character, really about lifestyle, really about quality of life. And this is a point that I'll touch on in a different video, because I think, there's a gross and I think it's a deliberate misrepresentation, quite frankly, of women, that all they care about is money. But one of the things we don't acknowledge is that resources and money impact and influence quality of life. Okay, so it's not necessarily about being materialistic or frivolous with money or wanting to keep up with the Joneses. It's actually sometimes as simple as being able to have a cleaner that takes some of that labor off your hands, being able to have a dishwasher if you've got a large family, thereby reducing labor that generally women are the ones undertaking. Some of this is about quality of life and well-being. And so what I see is, I've seen this rise in content that's sneaking in about a female loneliness epidemic on its way in the next decade, because women decided to withdraw from dating at the volume that a lot of women are. And here we have to understand that, you have to have your head screwed on straight. You absolutely, as a woman, have every right to make decisions about your interpersonal, intimate life that prioritize your well-being, your quality of life, your peace of mind, and your safety. Okay? Not every decision has to be political and systemic, okay? And that's why it's totally okay for you to not, for example, hate men, but also be selective about the men that you choose to date and a man that you might choose to marry and actually live with. Because intimate partner violence, for example, is prevalent, okay? High percentages of women die because of intimate partner violence. And so it is completely okay, for example, for you to be assessing a partner as to their actual safety. That's okay. And it's also okay for you to be assessing a partner in terms of your quality of life as well. Okay. And so I think we need to be really awake when we see these narratives around, women self-inflicting loneliness on themselves to the extent that in 10 years' time, they're going to be regretful. I have met many women, and I've read many stories of women, for example, who may have regretted not having children. But equally, there are just as many women who were on the fence or did not want them who do not have regrets. We have to remember that the decision to procreate, for example, is an important decision. It is not to be taken lightly. And so it is okay to take your time with making that decision, particularly if you're going to be having a child with another human being, which means you do absolutely need to assess and review his viability as a parent. That is not a reason to just decide to have children because you are scared or afraid of being lonely in 10, 15, 20 years' time. And actually, what are we comparing being single to? Are we comparing it to a healthy, mutually fulfilling marriage or relationship? Right? This is the thing that we have to be aware of, because actually, if it's just any relationship, that is not really a comparison worth making. It's not a comparison worth making. We need to be very specific, because a lot of the comparison I see being had is to people who are just generally dissatisfied in their relationships. And on top of that, what I think is so important here is that this encouragement for women to want less, accept less, and have less. Again, when I talk about this, the less people with less range think I'm talking about money. And I'm talking about women wanting to go on a 5-star holiday every single month. No. Women wanting to spend money on material items. No, I'm talking about actually women wanting to genuinely feel good in themselves and happy when they wake up in the morning. And this is another thing. You know, women are often positioned as vain and frivolous when they want to be happy and when they want to be happy in a relationship. And because of the world we live in, it's told women that actually you don't deserve to be happy. Happiness is not a real thing. It is not the right litmus test for life. You should stay in relationships that you're not happy in. You should settle in relationships with individuals that you don't feel any happiness with. You know, apparently, you know, happiness is so transitory. And by the way, I do believe happiness as a state of being is not permanent. But what I'm actually saying is long periods and sustained periods of dissatisfaction. Nobody has to live like that. And that's men and women. It's okay. It's okay to want more. It's okay to do what needs to be done so that you have higher, more sustained levels of joy, of peace and satisfaction. That is not a high bar. That's a bare minimum. And actually, science even proves that this is healthier for the human body and mind. It is not healthy to live in a sustained state of unhappiness. And so to encourage women to do that just so that they're in a relationship and not lonely and not accused of being lonely or threatened with loneliness, that is not wise. Okay, so the answer can't be that women should accept lower quality relationships simply to avoid the possibility of loneliness and being a statistic. I don't really care about those things. I don't think about it because ultimately it is my responsibility as an adult woman, okay, back to that piece, to build the life that I want and build a life that is enriching and upbuilding for me, regardless of my marital status. Now, here's the reality as we wrap this up. Is that some women will do that through marriage, some will do that through friendship, some will do that through community, some will do that through long-term relationships, some will do that through having lovers. But the reality is most women will do a combination of those things, right? And this is why I come back to the fact that loneliness is not a direct result of singleness, okay? And so it's not about whether or not you will fall lonely as you get older or in 10 years' time. The reality is everybody does experience loneliness at a different time for different reasons, okay? Every human being will. So the real consideration is kind of what kind of life are you building around that reality? Because the loneliness part is real. It is a reality for all human beings. So what kind of life are you building around that? So that's what I spoke about this week on the Substack. Like I say, the link will be in the description or in the comments. And I'm really interested in hearing what your thoughts are on loneliness, dealing with loneliness as you continue to do life.